Welcome to the first module of the first lecture of Minds and Madness, which is an introduction to the bio, the psycho, and the social. In particular, what I'm going to do in this and the rest of the modules is explore a number of case studies that gives a flavour for the subject that you are undertaking. So in this lecture, what I want to do is use those case studies listed down here as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to give you an idea of the themes that are woven through the whole of Minds and Madness. And the case studies, I hope, will spur your interest and get you engaged in the incredible material that we are about to look over. But first, I'd like to give an introduction about where we are now, the neurosciences, and what they mean in the overall context of Minds and Madness.
Here we are on the edge of the University of Melbourne, and I'm looking at the Kenneth Myer building, which is the new or relatively new neuroscience building that's been put up to bring under its umbrella all of the various neurosciences, include psychiatry as well. It tips its hat to the memory of the past by naming its cafe Dr. Dax after Eric Cunningham Dax, who came to Melbourne in 1950 to take over the mental hygiene authority for the Victorian government. The neuroscience building represents the latest turn in the history of treating mental illness. We'll see throughout the subject that the pendulum swings backwards and forwards between biological explanations of mental illness and psychological or psychosocial explanations of mental illness. At the moment, we live in an age where the neurosciences are the shiniest, the newest, the most promising of the sciences. They claim that they can tell us something not just about our illnesses, but about who we are, about our identity, and that they can tell us this through the biological model. But what the history of Minds and Madness tells us is something more complicated. That pendulum will keep swinging. There will keep being a need for understanding these conditions from the perspective of the psychosocial. There will always be a place for the psychosocial. We should not allow biological reductionism to run rampant. The history of Minds and Madness is fascinating. It's also incredibly disturbing. As we go through from the past to the present, we'll see the appalling treatment that people suffering from mental illness had been treated more or less like wild beasts during the 16th and 17th and 18th century. We'll see the kind of therapies carried out during the 20th century, like shock treatment and lobotomy, coma therapy, deep sleep therapy, a whole range of different ways of trying to combat one of the scourges of mankind. It's exciting and it's also disturbing. If we're not disturbed by it, then somehow we must be lacking in empathy. What I would say is, if any of it does upset you unduly, then please get in touch with me and I can put you on to the right people to talk to. At the same time, I think it's incredibly important that we know about how mental illness has been treated across the ages, because it gives us a roadmap to the future.
So let's start with D.H. Rosenhan's extraordinary article published in Science in 1973 on being sane in insane places. This really put the anti-psychiatry cat amongst the psychiatry pigeons. It set in chain a series of events that Rosenhan himself could not have predicted. But before we say a little bit about the piece, we should hear the man talk about it himself.
A different kind of criticism, but one that's just as provocative, has been leveled by David Rosenhan of Stanford University.
Between 1969 and 1972, a group of colleagues and I gained admission to psychiatric hospitals by faking a single symptom, which was that we said that we heard voices, and the voices said, empty, dull, thud. The moment we were admitted to the hospital, we abandoned our symptom, and we behaved the way we usually behave. The question was, would anyone detect that we were sane? The answer was, no. No one ever did. Admitted with the diagnosis in the main of paranoid schizophrenia, we were discharged with the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in remission. Now, in remission doesn't mean quite the same thing as sane. The term we use to describe the experience is dehumanized. Nobody talks to you. Nobody has any contact with you. The average contact of patients with staff was about 6.5 minutes a day. Nobody comes to visit. The first time I was in a psychiatric hospital, on an admissions ward with 41 men, my wife constituted 4 of the 7 visitors on a weekend. Psychiatric hospitals are storehouses for people in society whom you really don't want, whom you really don't understand, and for whom you've lost a great deal of sympathy. Staff need constantly to be reminded, and it's very hard to remind them. They are, after all, doing their best on the front end, but they need constantly to be reminded that the people who are their charges are not merely collections of symptoms. They are people with spouses, with children, with parents, with jobs, with mortgages and bills to pay, that they are, in the fullest sense of the word, very human and very unhappy.
I have no idea who that is, but must have been shot a while ago, judging by the moustache. So the experiment was a bit more complicated than Rosenhan put forward in that interview. The idea was to test how robust psychiatric diagnosis was at the time. And to do this, what he wanted to do was send sane people into an asylum and see if their sanity got noticed. These were all pseudo-patients recruited from graduate school, recruited from some of Rosenhan's students. And they go in claiming that they've experienced one small psychotic episode, saying thud, as he indicated in the video, was enough to get diagnosed with schizophrenia. Once in hospital, they behave completely sane with no recurrent episodes. They just sit there, observing what's going on, wondering if anyone is going to notice that they shouldn't be there. The staff treat them with a range of strategies, from outright hostility to ignoring them. Everything that they did seemed to be a reinforcement of the diagnosis itself. So, for example, Rosenhan had told his cadre of pseudo-patients not to take notes while they were in there, not to draw attention to themselves by writing. But these, being graduate students in particular, couldn't resist, and they sat there doing almost like ethnography or something, observing what was going on around them. And the staff weren't interested. All they saw in that was another manifestation of the crazy behaviour of those particular individuals. It is true that some of the patients noticed their normality, sensed that they were different and started asking questions, but the staff did not. They remained categorized and labeled as schizophrenic, and nothing they can do within the institution can change that, something that he called sticky labeling. And in fact, as he indicated, they left with the diagnosis still intact. It was an extraordinary experiment. But he did do a follow-up. He informed a hospital that knew about his research that in the next 3 months, his pseudo-patients would be descending upon them and would be presenting themselves to the clinicians as potential patients experiencing perhaps another thud episode. And he asked the admitting clinicians to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 the likelihood of each patient presenting themselves to the clinic being a pseudo-patient. And what happened was psychiatrists at the hospital detected pseudo-patients everywhere, and the admittance rate started dropping for that institution. So let's have a think. Stop and think a bit. Think a bit more. How many pseudo-patients do you think Rosenhan sent to the hospital? How many? Of course, none. None whatsoever were presented. Now, to me, Rosenhan epitomizes many things that are deeply important to Minds and Madness. Firstly, the fragmented state of psychiatry in the early 1970s. To put it bluntly, it was a mess of competing factions. On the one hand, you had the anti-psychiatrists like Rosenhan, often existentialists, who believed, for example, that many psychiatric conditions were the product of the psychiatrists themselves, that the conditions were iatrogenic, or even that people experiencing psychiatric diseases had actually had those triggered or caused by society. And then there were the psychoanalysts, was still, particularly in the USA, in the era of Freud and post-Freud, and a lot of psychiatry in the USA is being carried out still by psychoanalysts who are under attack from a much smaller fragment of biological psychiatrists, people that believe that mental diseases are created by something going wrong biologically in your body or to be the product of the genes that you've inherited. Often these figures were people that we call neo-Krepelinians. In other words, they were the followers of the great psychiatrist Krepelin, who was practicing at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, and was responsible for identifying, through clustering symptoms, the twin pillars of the modern psychoses: schizophrenia, which he called dementia praecox, and manic depression, which obviously we now call bipolar. And these biological psychiatrists wanted to turf the psychoanalysts out, and they didn't have a lot of time for the existentialists either. And they wanted to reform the whole process of diagnosis and treatment. So that's where we were at when Rosenhan conducted his experiment. I think as well that we need to explore this issue of the ontological status of mental malady, what you could call the is it real question. Now, it is true, and we will see this time and time again, that diseases come in and out of fashion. We get things like drapetomania, look it up, it was something suffered by slaves. Sluggishly progressing schizophrenia, which was a favourite diagnosis in the Soviet Union of individuals who happened to be dissidents against the regime. And hysteria, which has pretty much disappeared from the psychiatric landscape. These are all transient mental illnesses that at the time seemed incredibly real, but then seem to disappear off the face of the earth. And we can see an example of this later on when we look at multiple personality disorder, which I'll be having a go at in this lecture in a couple of modules' time. MPD has virtually disappeared, rebranded dissociative identity disorder, and a lot of the theory behind it has been completely and utterly trashed. But the other thing to note is that etiology, that is, the things that are thought to cause a disease, is like a pendulum which swings backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. At one peak, there is the biological explanations for mental illness, bang, swings back to the other peak where psychosocial explanations are made for mental illness. Very rarely in the history of Minds and Madness do we find the biological and the psychosocial working together. Arguably, that might be the case today. But we're going to see this swinging pendulum where one or the other is more in fashion and the other is out of fashion. We're going to see this time and time again. And the other thing that I would say critically, and I won't dwell on this in any particular detail, is that disease categories and diagnosis are often shaped by social forces. And referring back to drapetomania or sluggishly progressing schizophrenia or hysteria, we see that process going on